The oppressive August heat of Decatur, Georgia, was a physical weight, pressing down on the mourners gathered around the freshly turned earth. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and damp soil, felt suffocating. For Zariah Olusegun, the heat was nothing compared to the icy dread coiling in her stomach. She stood beside her stepmother, Imani, a pillar of perfect tragic grace in a tailored black dress. Imani's sobs were a masterclass in grief, hitching at just the right moments, punctuated by the delicate dab of a lace handkerchief to her tearless eyes. Everyone saw a widow shattered by loss. Zaria saw a performance. Her father, Dari Olusegun, a man whose laughter had been the bedrock of their home, was gone. At 47, he had been a vibrant, strong lineman for Georgia Power, a man who could fix anything, and whose hands, though calloused, were always gentle. The doctors had called it acute renal failure, a sudden, inexplicable shutdown of his system. It had been shockingly fast. 1 week he was complaining of unusual fatigue and headaches. The next, he was gone. Imani, a respected nurse at DeKalb Medical, had been by his side, the very picture of the devoted, knowledgeable wife. She'd brewed him special herbal teas to combat the fatigue, insisted he take vitamins she brought home from the hospital, and dismissed his concerns as simple overwork. "You just need to rest, my love," she'd cooed, her voice a syrupy balm of false concern. Now, as the pastor spoke of Dari's journey to a better place, Zaria's mind replayed those final weeks. The strange, sweet taste her father had mentioned in his tea. The way Imani's attentiveness felt less like care and more like surveillance. The anger and bitterness were a toxic cocktail inside her, but she held it in, her expression a stoic mask that neighbors mistook for shock. Rochelle, Imani's best friend and a prim administrative clerk from the hospital, stood on Imani's other side, her arm wrapped supportively around her. The two of them were a fortress of shared sorrow, a sight that made Zaria's skin crawl. Later that evening, the house was finally quiet. The last of the sympathetic neighbors had departed, leaving behind plates of untouched casserole and a silence that was heavier than any sound. Zaria lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day a blurry, painful montage. Sleep was a distant shore she couldn't reach. Around 2 a.m., a faint sound from downstairs pricked the silence, a soft, rhythmic clinking. It was out of place, too deliberate for the house settling. Driven by a premonition she couldn't name, Zaria slipped out of bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool hardwood floors as she crept to the top of the stairs. The dim glow of the under-cabinet light in the kitchen cast long shadows down the hallway. Peeking around the corner, she saw a sight that froze the blood in her veins. Imani was standing at the kitchen sink, her back to the stairs. The grief-stricken widow was gone. In her place was a woman of chilling focus and precision. She wasn't crying. Her face, reflected faintly in the dark window above the sink, was a mask of cold concentration. She was wearing thin latex gloves and meticulously cleaning a small glass vial, the kind Zaria had seen in science labs. She washed it, dried it with a paper towel, then held it up to the light, inspecting it for any smudges or residue. Her movements were economical, practiced, like a surgeon cleaning her instruments after a procedure. Satisfied, she carefully wrapped the vial in a fresh paper towel, walked over to the pantry, and tucked it away inside an old, forgotten canister of oatmeal on the highest shelf. She peeled off the gloves, sealed them in a Ziploc bag, and buried them deep in the kitchen trash. As she turned, her eyes swept the darkened entryway. For a heart-stopping second, Zaria thought she'd been seen. But Imani's gaze was empty, her expression unreadable. She walked calmly from the kitchen and headed back to the master bedroom, the one she no longer shared with Zaria's father, without a single backward glance. Zaria remained frozen, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The image of the vial, glinting in the low light, was burned into her mind. It wasn't the action of a grieving woman clearing out painful memories. It was the action of someone destroying evidence. The question was, evidence of what? 3 months after the funeral, the stifling Georgia heat had given way to a crisp autumn chill, but the cold Zaria felt had nothing to do with the weather. It radiated from the plaintiff's table in the DeKalb County Courthouse, where Imani sat, once again the picture of bereaved dignity. The lawsuit she'd filed against Sentinel Life Insurance was in full swing. The company was contesting the $750,000 payout, citing the policy's recent issue date, just 8 months before Dari's death, as highly suspicious. Mrs. Olusegun, the insurance company's lawyer, a sharp man named Mr. Davies, began. Can you explain why you and your husband, after nearly 20 years of marriage, suddenly decided to take out such a substantial life insurance policy? Imani's voice trembled perfectly on cue. My Dari, he was a planner. We had just paid off our mortgage. He wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to him, Zaria's college would be paid for, and I wouldn't have to worry. Her eyes welled with tears as she looked towards the jury. He loved us. Is it a crime to want to protect your family? Several jurors nodded in sympathy. Zaria, sitting in the back pew, felt a surge of hot rage. Rochelle was there too, seated directly behind Imani, offering a supportive pat on the shoulder during recesses. Their bond seemed unbreakable, their shared story of loss impenetrable. Zaria knew she couldn't fight this performance with feelings. She needed facts. She needed proof. That weekend, while Imani was out for a grief counseling lunch with Rochelle, Zaria began her search. She told herself she was looking for old papers, for her father's will, anything to feel close to him. But she knew deep down she was looking for a weapon. She started in the master bedroom, a space that now felt alien and cold. Imani had kept it largely untouched, claiming it was too painful to change anything. Zaria knew it was part of the act. She pulled a step stool to the closet, her hands reaching for the storage boxes on the top shelf. They were filled with old tax records, holiday decorations, and family memorabilia. As she pulled down a heavy box labeled Vacations, her grip slipped. It tilted, spilling its contents across the floor in a cascade of faded photographs and postcards. Damn it, she muttered, kneeling to clean up the mess. She gathered photos of a younger Dari, holding her on his shoulders at Stone Mountain, of family trips to Savannah, of Christmases past. Then her fingers brushed against a photograph that didn't belong. It was newer, the colors sharp and vibrant, the finish glossy. It was a world away from the sun-faded memories scattered around it. The picture was of a sun-drenched beach, white sand meeting a turquoise ocean. In the foreground, Imani, radiant in a bright red bikini, was locked in a passionate embrace with Rochelle. They were kissing, not a friendly peck, but a deep, intimate kiss that spoke of a long, hidden relationship. Zaria's hands began to shake. She flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in Rochelle's elegant handwriting was a date from 4 months ago and a caption, Our forever starts now, Key West. Love you always, R. Key West. Not Chicago. 4 months ago, Imani had told them she was attending a mandatory nursing symposium in Chicago for 3 days. She had even shown Zaria and Dari a detailed brochure of the event. It was an elaborate lie. The entire trip was a lie. This single photograph ripped a hole in the carefully constructed narrative of the perfect wife. It wasn't just proof of an affair, it was proof of a secret life, a foundation of deceit upon which everything else was built. Zaria carefully pocketed the photograph, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The image of Imani kissing Rochelle was shocking, but the implication was terrifying. What else had she been lying about? The photograph was a key, but Zaria knew it didn't unlock the whole story. An affair and a lie, however damning, weren't proof of murder. Back in the safety of her bedroom, with the door locked, she opened her laptop. The quiet hum of the machine was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The internet was a vast, impersonal ocean of information, and she was about to dive into its darkest depths. She started with broad search terms: poisons that mimic natural causes, undetectable poisons, poisons causing kidney failure. The results were a terrifying catalog of toxins and chemicals. As she clicked through link after link, one substance kept reappearing: ethylene glycol, the primary component of antifreeze. She read an article from a medical journal detailing the symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. A chill, colder than any autumn wind, crept up her spine. Drowsiness, nausea, headaches, confusion, slurred speech, convulsions, and finally, acute renal failure. It was a perfect, horrifying match. Every single symptom mirrored what her father had experienced in his final, agonizing days. The article mentioned one other crucial detail. Ethylene glycol has a distinctively sweet taste. Suddenly her father's voice echoed in her memory. a casual comment made just a week before he was hospitalized. "Honey, this new herbal tea of yours has a strange sweetness to it," he'd said to Imani with a chuckle. "You go a little heavy on the sugar?" Imani had simply smiled and replied, "It's a special blend of stevia and herbs, good for your energy levels." The memory hit Zarya with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't stevia. She was sure of it now. Her mind raced to the garage, where her father kept a shelf of automotive fluids for his old Ford pickup. There were always bottles of antifreeze there. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture so monstrous she could barely stand to look at it. But she needed more. A jury wouldn't convict someone based on a symptom list from WebMD and a vague memory. Her next thought was a gamble, a shot in the dark. She knew Imani often used her tablet in the evenings, scrolling through news sites and medical journals. She waited until Imani was in the shower, the sound of running water providing cover. Zarya slipped into the master bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. The tablet was on the nightstand. She picked it up, her fingers fumbling with the power button. No password. Imani, in her arrogance, hadn't bothered with one. She opened the web browser, her breath catching in her throat. The search history was the first place she looked. It was mostly innocuous. Recipes, nursing schedules, news headlines. Imani was clever. She would have cleared it. But Zarya's tech-savvy generation knew things her stepmother didn't. She went into the browser's advanced settings, looking for a way to recover deleted data or view cached pages. She found a feature that showed recent activity linked to the account, not just the device. And there it was. Dated 5 months ago, just before her father's symptoms began, was a series of searches that made her blood run cold. Lethal dose of ethylene glycol for 200 lb male. How long for antifreeze to become untraceable in the body? Does standard autopsy detect ethylene glycol? Ways to mask sweet taste of antifreeze. It was a blueprint for murder, cold, calculated, and researched with the clinical detachment of the nurse she was. Zarya quickly took pictures of the screen with her phone, her hands trembling so badly the first few shots were blurry. She didn't just have a motive anymore. She had a methodology. She had the digital ghost of Imani's monstrous plan right in her hands. She carefully placed the tablet back on the nightstand, exactly as she had found it, and retreated to her room. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of a killer, and Zarya was living under her roof. The next morning, armed with the photo from Key West and the damning pictures of Imani's search history on her phone, Zarya walked into the Decatur Police Department. The building was sterile and impersonal, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. She felt small and out of place. After a brief wait, she was shown into the office of Detective Miller, a white man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a weary slump to his shoulders. The office was cluttered with case files and takeout containers, a map of DeKalb County on the wall, dotted with colored pins. Zarya laid out her story as calmly and logically as she could. She started with her father's sudden illness, the insurance policy, and then presented her evidence, the photograph of Imani and Rochelle, and the screenshots from the tablet. "My stepmother is a nurse," Zarya finished, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She knew exactly what she was doing. She poisoned my father for the insurance money so she could start a new life with her girlfriend. Detective Miller listened patiently, his face an unreadable mask. He picked up the photograph, examining it with a detached air. He glanced at the screenshots on her phone. When she was done, he leaned back in his squeaky chair and steepled his fingers, a gesture that seemed more patronizing than thoughtful. "Ms. Olusegun," he began, his tone gentle but dismissive. "That's a very serious accusation." He slid the photograph back across the desk. "This proves your stepmother was having an affair. It's a betrayal, I understand, but it's not murder. As for these internet searches," he sighed, "she's a medical professional. As she would likely claim, she could have been researching a case she encountered at the hospital. It's all circumstantial." Zarya felt a familiar, sinking feeling. It was the polite bureaucratic wall she'd seen her father encounter countless times. "But the symptoms, the timeline, the insurance, it all fits," she insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "Look, Zarya," Miller said, using her first name in a way that felt like a dismissal of her maturity. Your father's death was ruled to be from natural causes by the medical examiner. You've been through a terrible trauma. Sometimes when we're grieving, our minds look for someone to blame, for a simple explanation to a tragedy. It's a way of coping. He offered her a sad, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. He saw a hysterical black teenager, not a credible witness. His weariness seemed to deepen when looking at her, as if her problem was just another unsolvable piece of urban misery he'd have to file away. He promised to keep the file open and look into it, but Zariah knew what that meant. It meant her evidence would be placed in a folder at the bottom of a very tall stack. She left the station feeling more alone and vulnerable than ever. The system wasn't going to help her. That night, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken tension. Zariah tried to act normal, but she could feel Imani's eyes on her. Around 10 p.m., there was a soft knock on her bedroom door. Imani entered, holding a steaming mug. Her face was arranged into a mask of maternal concern. "I noticed you've seemed so on edge lately, honey," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I brewed you some of my special chamomile tea. It will help you sleep." Zariah's eyes locked on the mug. It was the same type of mug her father had always used. Her mind screamed. She could almost taste the cloying, chemical sweetness. Was this it? Was Imani trying to silence her too? The smile on Imani's face was serene, but her eyes were like chips of ice. They held a silent, terrifying challenge. "Thank you, Imani," Zariah said, her voice miraculously even. She reached for the mug, and as her fingers closed around it, she let her hand jerk, as if startled. The hot liquid sloshed over the side, spilling onto the carpet and her hand. "Oh, I'm so clumsy!" she cried out, feigning surprise and pain. The tea, what was left of it, was just tea. Or was it? Imani's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, disappointment, annoyance, flashed in her eyes before it was gone. "Be careful, dear," she said softly, handing Zariah a napkin. "We wouldn't want you to have an accident." The threat was no longer veiled. It was hanging in the air between them, as clear and as deadly as the poison Zariah was sure had been in that cup. The incident with the tea was a declaration of war. Zariah knew she was no longer just an investigator, she was prey. The house, her childhood sanctuary, now felt like a cage with a predator who was growing bolder. Imani's demeanor shifted. The mask of the grieving widow was replaced by one of watchful, cloying concern. She was always there, asking Zariah where she was going, who she was talking to. "It's just that I worry about you so much, all alone," she'd say, her words a sweet poison of their own. Zariah started noticing small, unsettling things. A folder on her laptop containing her research would be moved to the trash bin. A window in her room she was sure she had locked would be found slightly ajar. One afternoon, she came out of her part-time job at a local coffee shop to find one of her car's tires completely flat. The mechanic later told her it looked like the valve stem had been deliberately loosened, a slow leak designed to cause a problem later, perhaps on the highway. It was psychological warfare, designed to make her feel paranoid, to make her doubt her own sanity. She confided in her father's sister, her Aunt Nikki, who lived in Atlanta. Nikki listened, her concern growing with every word. "Zariah, this is dangerous," she pleaded over the phone. "You need to get out of that house. Come stay with me." But Zariah refused. Leaving felt like surrender. It meant letting Imani win. "I can't, Aunt Nikki," she'd said, her voice tight with resolve. "I'm the only one who knows. I have to see this through for Dad." Her father had always told her, "The Oluseguns don't run from a fight." She wouldn't start now. Remembering her father's love for tinkering in the garage, Zariah felt a pull to the one place in the house that still felt like his. It smelled of sawdust, oil, and his memory. She searched through his old toolboxes and cluttered workbenches, not sure what she was looking for. A clue? An answer? In a dusty, forgotten book on automotive repair, tucked between pages on spark plug replacement, she found it. A small silver key taped to the page with a single piece of yellowed electrical tape. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It looked like a key to a safe deposit box. A wave of hope, the first she'd felt in months, washed over her. A few days later, her suspicion that she was being actively hunted was terrifyingly confirmed. She had a day off from school and had planned to visit the banks in the area to try the key. She told Imani she was going to the library to study with friends. The lie came easily now. But as she was about to leave, Imani announced she was feeling unwell and would be staying home from work. Zaria's plans were thwarted. Trapped in the house, she retreated to her room, feigning homework. Late in the afternoon, the silence was broken by the sound of Rochelle's car pulling into the driveway. Zaria crept to her door, cracking it open just enough to listen. Imani and Rochelle were in the living room, their voices low but sharp, carrying clearly up the stairs. "You should have been more careful with that tea," Rochelle hissed. What if she'd actually drunk some of it and gotten sick, but not, it would bring suspicion right to you. "I had to do something." Imani's voice was cold, stripped of all its usual warmth. She went to the police. "I got a call from a community liaison officer at the hospital, asking some very polite, very pointed questions about Dari's final days. That little bitch is digging." There was a pause. Then Rochelle's voice dropped even lower, becoming a venomous whisper. "She knows too much, Imani. We're too close to getting that money. We have to solve this. Permanently." "What are you suggesting?" Imani asked, though her tone implied she already knew. "An accident," Rochelle said, the word hanging in the air. "She's a teenager. She drives that old car. Brakes fail. A tragic accident, just months after losing her father. Everyone will be so sorry for you, the poor woman who has lost everything." Zaria's blood ran cold. She backed away from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. This wasn't just in her head. They were actively plotting to kill her. The key in her pocket suddenly felt like the heaviest thing in the world. It wasn't just a clue anymore. It was her only hope for survival. The overheard conversation lit a fire under Zaria. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but now it was sharpened by a desperate sense of urgency. She had to get to that safe deposit box. The next day, she fabricated a story about a mandatory all-day school field trip, a lie she reinforced by having her best friend text Imani a fake confirmation from a teacher. The moment Imani's car pulled out of the driveway for her morning shift at the hospital, Zaria was out the door, the silver key clutched in her sweaty palm. She started with the largest banks in downtown Decatur, her heart sinking with each polite refusal. "Sorry, we don't have a record of a box under that name." On her fourth try, at a small local credit union her father had used for years, the teller recognized the key's design. After verifying Zaria's identity and presenting a copy of her father's death certificate, she was led into the vault. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the sound of the teller inserting 2 keys and pulling out a long metal box. Left alone in a private viewing room, Zaria stared at the box. It felt like a final message from her father. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, there wasn't money or jewelry. It was a single, thick manila folder. Her father, the meticulous planner Imani had described in court, had been planning for something else entirely. He had started to suspect. The folder contained a collection of documents that laid out a chilling timeline. There were printouts of his own online research with search terms like metallic taste in mouth, sudden confusion, and symptoms of slow poisoning. He had been trying to understand what was happening to him. Below that was a detailed report from a private investigator he had hired just 2 weeks before his death. Dari had told the PI he was concerned about his wife's erratic behavior and financial secrecy. The PI's report was concise and devastating. It included photographs of Imani and Rochelle meeting covertly at out-of-the-way motels. It confirmed, with flight manifests and hotel receipts, the trip to Key West, not Chicago. Most damning of all, it included financial statements showing Imani had recently opened a new joint bank account with Rochelle, and a preliminary sales agreement for a beachfront condominium in Naples, Florida, with a significant down payment that had been made just days before Dari hired the investigator. Imani wasn't just having an affair. She was liquidating their shared assets to fund a new life. He had known. Her father had known he was being betrayed, even if he hadn't yet realized he was being murdered. The realization brought a fresh wave of grief, but also a fierce, burning pride. He had been fighting for the truth, for her, until the very end. He had left her a roadmap. At the very bottom of the box, beneath the PI's report, lay a small black USB flash drive. Taped to it was a folded sticky note. Zaria's hands shook as she unfolded it. It was her father's familiar, strong handwriting. "Zaria, it read. If you are reading this, it means I wasn't able to finish what I started. Don't trust anyone. Trust your gut. The truth is in the rose garden. I love you more than words can say. Dad. The rose garden. Zaria's mind flashed to the small, meticulously kept garden in their backyard. After her father died, Imani had, in a strange fit of activity, dug up a section of the lawn to plant a new, extravagant bed of blood-red roses. At the time, Zaria had thought it was an odd way to grieve, especially since her father had always disliked the fussy, high-maintenance flowers. He had preferred simple, wild daisies. Now, his words cast the memory in a sinister new light. The truth was in the rose garden. It was a cryptic final clue from beyond the grave, and Zaria knew she had to find out what it meant. She gathered the documents, her resolve hardening into steel. This was no longer just about justice. It was about finishing her father's fight. Clutching the manila folder from her father's safe deposit box, Zaria felt a shift in the balance of power. She was no longer operating on suspicion and digital ghosts. She had tangible, undeniable proof of motive and conspiracy. The next morning, she bypassed the front desk at the police department and asked to speak directly with Detective Miller. She refused to be fobbed off. In his cluttered office, she didn't speak. She simply opened the folder and laid the contents on his desk. The PI's report, the photos of Imani and Rochelle, the Florida real estate agreement, the financial statements, and finally, her father's handwritten note. She watched as Miller's expression transformed from weary skepticism to sharp, focused interest. The patronizing demeanor vanished. He read through every page, his silence punctuated by an occasional low whistle. The evidence was methodical, damning, and laid out a clear path from betrayal to financial motive. His own private investigator, Miller murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. The man knew something was deeply wrong. He looked at Zaria, his eyes holding a newfound respect. This changes things. This changes everything. He assured her that this time it would be different. He would launch a full, albeit unofficial, investigation immediately while he worked to get a warrant. He needed to build a case so airtight that Imani couldn't slip through. His first calls were to the Financial Crimes Unit to verify the bank accounts and to a contact in Florida to confirm the property deal. The most important thing now, Miller warned her, his voice low and serious, is that you go home and act as if nothing has changed. Don't let her know you have this. Don't let her know we've spoken. We have one chance to catch her, and we can't afford to spook her. Returning home felt like stepping onto a movie set where she was the only one who knew the script. The house, once a prison, was now a stage. Zaria played her part, feigning interest in school, complaining about homework, acting like a normal, sullen teenager. But the performance was exhausting. Every shared meal was fraught with tension. Every pleasantry from Imani felt like a threat. Imani, however, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Perhaps it was Zaria's inability to completely mask her resolve, or perhaps her own paranoia was escalating. A few days after Zaria's meeting with Miller, a technician arrived at the house. Imani announced she was upgrading their home security system. With all the break-ins in the neighborhood, we can't be too careful, she explained with a bright, false smile. The upgrade was a network of smart cameras, small, discrete devices placed in the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, even one pointed directly at the backyard. The system came with an app that allowed Imani to view the live feed from her phone, wherever she was. Zaria's blood ran cold. The rose garden, her father's final clue, was now under constant surveillance. Imani hadn't just built a security system. She had fortified her secrets. The house was no longer just a cage. It was a fortress, and Zaria was trapped inside with the warden, who was watching her every move. Her one chance to investigate the garden seemed to have vanished. She was a prisoner, and the truth her father had hinted at was buried just feet away, protected by a 24/7 digital eye. Weeks crawled by. Zaria was trapped in a nerve-wracking stalemate, living under the constant, unblinking gaze of Imani's cameras. Meanwhile, Detective Miller was methodically building his case in the background. The financial investigation had confirmed everything in the PI's report and uncovered more. Imani had been systematically siphoning money from her husband's accounts for months. It was enough to get a judge to sign a search warrant for the house and property. The raid happened on a Tuesday morning. Zaria was at school, a deliberate move by Miller to keep her safe and out of the way. Imani was ambushed as she returned from a night shift, her face a mask of shocked indignation, as Miller and a team of uniformed officers presented the warrant. The search was thorough, professional, and ultimately fruitless. They combed through the house, the garage, Imani's car. They found nothing. Imani, ever the meticulous planner, had scrubbed her home clean of any incriminating physical evidence. The bottles of antifreeze in the garage were all sealed, new. There were no hidden vials, no suspicious powders, no carelessly discarded gloves. Miller called Zaria late in the afternoon, his voice heavy with frustration. "We've turned the place upside down. Nothing. She's too smart, too clean. The DA is getting hesitant to move forward without a smoking gun." "The Rose Garden," Zaria said, her voice quiet but firm. "Detective, my father's note said the truth is in the Rose Garden. You have to look there." "We did," Miller countered. "We did a surface search. There's nothing." "No," Zaria insisted, a desperate idea forming in her mind. "You need to look under it. She planted it after he died. He hated roses. It has to mean something." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Miller was a traditional detective who relied on paper trails and human intelligence. Digging up a garden based on a cryptic note felt like a long shot. "All right, kid," he finally sighed. "I'll see what I can do." The next day, Miller returned to the Olusegun house. But this time, he wasn't alone. He brought a specialist, a stern-faced K-9 officer and his partner, a magnificent German shepherd named Shadow. Shadow was a cadaver dog, but he was also cross-trained to detect a range of chemical compounds, including the unique signature of ethylene glycol. The K-9 officer led Shadow to the backyard. The dog began his work, trotting back and forth in a grid pattern, his nose twitching, taking in the world in a way no human ever could. He swept past the patio, the old oak tree, the shed. He showed no interest. Then the officer guided him towards the pristine rose garden. The polarizing image was stark. The beautiful blood-red blooms, a symbol of love and passion, were now the focus of a grim search for death. Shadow circled the rosebed once, then twice. He stopped, his head cocked, his nose hovering just above the mulch at the base of the largest, most vibrant bush. A low whine escaped his throat. He looked back at his handler, then back at the spot, and began to dig frantically with his front paws, sending dark soil flying. He let out a sharp, decisive bark. It was the signal. "He's got something," the K-9 officer announced, his voice tight with anticipation. Miller motioned for two officers with shovels to come forward. Imani, who had been forced to watch the entire spectacle from her kitchen window, stood frozen, the color draining from her face. The search was no longer a fruitless exercise. It was a targeted excavation, and as the first shovelful of earth was turned over, Zaria knew, wherever she was, that her father's final message was about to be unearthed. The officers dug carefully around the spot Shadow had indicated, mindful not to disturb whatever was buried there. The rich, dark soil gave way, and about 2 feet down, one of the shovels made a dull clink against something solid. Brushing away the remaining dirt with their hands, they uncovered it. A small object wrapped tightly in multiple layers of black plastic and sealed with duct tape. The package was heavy, dense. It felt like a stone. Detective Miller knelt, pulling on a pair of latex gloves before lifting the object from the earth. He carefully sliced through the tape and peeled back the layers of plastic. Inside, nestled in the dirt-caked wrapping, was the object of their search. It was the small glass vial Zaria had seen Imani cleaning on the night of the funeral. It was almost full of a clear, slightly viscous liquid. Unscrewing the cap, Miller cautiously wafted the air towards his nose. The smell was faint but unmistakable. The sickly, sweet chemical odor of antifreeze. "We got it," Miller said, his voice a low, triumphant growl. "We got the smoking gun." Inside the house, Imani watched through the window as the vial was placed into an evidence bag. The facade she had so carefully maintained for months finally cracked. A strangled cry escaped her lips, and she stumbled back from the window, her face ashen. The game was over, she knew it. With the discovery of the vial, the district attorney had more than enough to proceed. Miller immediately secured a warrant for the exhumation of Dari Olusegun's body. It was a grim necessity, the final piece of the puzzle. The toxicology lab would be able to test tissue samples specifically for the presence of ethylene glycol and its metabolites, a test the initial standard autopsy had never performed. While they waited for the legal process to unfold, Miller put a covert surveillance team on Imani and Rochelle. He had a strong feeling they wouldn't wait around for the inevitable. His instinct proved correct. 2 days after the search, an officer from the surveillance team called him with urgent news. "Detective, you're not going to believe this," the officer said, his voice hushed. Olusegun and her friend, Rochelle Jerry, just left a travel agency in Northlake. My source inside confirmed they booked 2 one-way first-class tickets to Cancun, Mexico. The flight leaves from Hartsfield-Jackson tomorrow morning at 6:15 a.m. They paid in cash. They were running. The discovery in the garden had pushed them over the edge. They were about to abandon their lives, the insurance money, everything, in a desperate bid for freedom. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. This was no longer a slow-moving investigation. It was a race against time. He couldn't risk arresting them now. They could be out on bail and vanish before he had the final toxicology report in hand. He had to catch them in the act of fleeing the country. "Don't lose them," Miller ordered the officer. "We're going to let them think they're getting away. We'll set up a welcome party for them at the airport." He hung up the phone, a grim smile on his face. The net had been cast, and tomorrow morning, at the world's busiest airport, he was going to pull it tight. For Zarya and for Dari, the long night was almost over. The final act was about to begin. The pre-dawn chill of the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport Terminal was electric with the quiet hum of early morning travelers. Imani Olusegun and Rochelle Jerry, dressed in casual but expensive travel clothes, moved through the sparse crowds with an air of forced calm. They checked their bags, obtained their boarding passes, and made their way towards the security checkpoint. The promise of a new life in Mexico almost within their grasp. They believed they had slipped away, that their plan had worked. They were wrong. As they presented their passports and boarding passes to the TSA agent, 2 figures stepped out from behind a nearby pillar. Imani Olusegun, Rochelle Jerry. Detective Miller's voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. He was flanked by 2 uniformed airport police officers. Imani's head whipped around, her face instantly contorting from feigned nonchalance to pure shock. Rochelle let out a small, terrified gasp. "You're both under arrest," Miller continued, his eyes locked on Imani, "on suspicion of the murder of Dari Olusegun." The arrest was quick and professional. The quiet commotion drew stares, but it was over in seconds as the 2 women were handcuffed and led away. The flight to Cancun would be leaving without them. The trial was a media sensation in DeKalb County. The story of the respected nurse and the grieving widow, who was actually a cold-blooded killer, was the stuff of primetime crime dramas. The prosecution, led by a sharp assistant district attorney, laid out their case with devastating precision. They presented the financial records, the PI's report, the Key West photograph, and the digital trail of Imani's incriminating internet searches. The K-9 officer in shadow took the stand, explaining how the vial of ethylene glycol was discovered. The toxicologist from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation delivered the final, irrefutable blow. Dari Olusegun's exhumed remains contained massive, lethal concentrations of ethylene glycol. He had been slowly and systematically poisoned over a period of weeks. Throughout the trial, Imani remained a statue of defiant silence, her expression a cold mask of contempt. It was Rochelle who cracked. Faced with the mountain of evidence and the prospect of life in prison without parole, her loyalty to Imani evaporated. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she would testify against her former lover and tell the entire truth. On the stand, a tearful Rochelle painted a chilling picture of greed and manipulation. She claimed the entire plan was Imani's idea from the start. "She told me Dari was a roadblock to our future," Rochelle sobbed. "She said with her medical knowledge, she could make it look like a natural death. No one would ever suspect a thing. She was so confident." Rochelle detailed how Imani would add small, measured doses of antifreeze to Dari's evening herbal tea, gradually increasing the amount to overwhelm his kidneys without raising immediate alarm. The insurance money was meant to fund their escape to a life of luxury in Florida. As Rochelle's testimony reached its climax, something inside Imani finally snapped. Her carefully controlled composure shattered. She leaped to her feet, her chair clattering to the floor behind her. "Liar!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling accusatory finger at the witness stand. Her voice, raw with fury, echoed through the stunned courtroom. "You cowardly, pathetic liar. It was our idea. You wanted that money just as much as I did. You helped me pick out the damn condo. It was a fatal, irreversible mistake." In that single, uncontrolled outburst of rage, she had confessed. She had not only admitted her guilt, but had obliterated any shred of doubt the jury might have held. A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the gallery. The judge hammered his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Imani's lawyer slumped in his chair, head in his hands. He had just witnessed his client convict herself in the most dramatic way possible. Imani stood there, panting, her eyes blazing with a hatred that had finally burned through her perfect facade, exposing the monster beneath her for all the world to see. The jury's verdict was a formality. Imani Olusegun was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her final chilling act in the courtroom was to turn and fix Zaria with a stare of pure, unadulterated hatred, a silent promise of a vengeance she would never be able to enact. Rochelle Jerry, as per her plea bargain, received a sentence of 20 years with eligibility for parole in 15. Justice, hard-won and painful, had been served. 6 months later, Zaria stood with Detective Miller in front of her father's grave. Spring had arrived in Decatur, and the dogwood trees were in full bloom, their white and pink blossoms a gentle counterpoint to the somber gray of the headstone. Zaria had moved in with her Aunt Nikki in Atlanta immediately after the arrests, leaving the house in Decatur and its poison memories behind. The house was sold, its proceeds, along with her father's other assets, placed in a trust for her. The insurance company, once their staunchest opponent, had quietly settled, with the full $750,000 policy being awarded to Zaria as the sole legal heir. "I wanted to thank you," Zaria said, her voice soft, "for finally believing me." Miller looked out over the peaceful cemetery, a rare look of humility on his face. "I should have listened sooner," he admitted. "I was jaded. I saw a file, not a family. You reminded me that behind every case file is a human being looking for the truth. You taught me a lesson I won't forget." He had been wrong, and he was man enough to admit it. His initial dismissal had been colored by unconscious bias, a failure he was now determined to correct in his future work. Zaria nodded, accepting his apology. She had enrolled in the fall semester at Emory University, choosing to major in criminology and forensic science. The ordeal had not broken her, it had forged her. It had given her a purpose. "I want to be a voice for people who aren't being heard," she explained. "Like me, like my dad." She placed a small bouquet of wild daisies, her father's favorite, on the grave. The money was a means to an end, the education her father had always dreamed for her, the chance to build a life on her own terms. It could never replace what she had lost, but it could be used to honor his memory. "I think he'd be proud," she whispered, looking up at the clear blue sky. As they walked away from the grave and back towards the sunlit path, Zaria felt a lightness that had been absent for over a year. The weight of suspicion, fear, and grief had finally begun to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve and a budding sense of hope. The world was not a safe or simple place. She knew that now with a certainty that chilled her, but she also knew that it contained people like her father, who left clues of love behind, and people like Miller, who could learn and change. The final lesson of her father's death was a bitter but powerful one. Justice is not an abstract concept delivered by a flawless system. It is a fragile, human endeavor that must be fought for. It requires courage to speak truth to power, resilience to stand against a wall of doubt and prejudice, and an unwavering belief that even when it is buried beneath lies and beautiful blood-red roses, the truth is worth digging for. Dari Olusegun's story was over, but his daughter's was just beginning, and she would carry his fight for truth forward with every step she took.